Good morning, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020. And this is the continuation of McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. It's our backup channel, which we started when we had our first strike with YouTube last summer. And now we are broadcasting here as our main channel. So mark your calendars for our next shows, which you can see on screamingospreys.com, where our great Catherine Jumping Mouse keeps our calendar up to date and makes beautiful weekly teasers, as well as a special announcement for today's show, which is all about The Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty. So I've got a lot of material to cover this morning. I wanted you to see that my dad's up here over my shoulder this morning, because this is a very important show to me, and I hope to each of you who's interested in what really happened in the 50s, 60s, and leading to my dad's death in 71. So, hey, Guillermo, glad to have you here, and Corky, Kathy, thank you for being here, and yeah, keeping everybody straight. Well, I'll get started in just a second. First, a little sip of something to drink. And just give me a second and I'll be ready to roll. Well, good morning to everybody. Yeah, what really happened? That's the question, what really happened. And my dad was right in the thick of it. And the more I studied his career, the more I am amazed that he lived as long as he did. He was totally exposed to all kinds of very, very nasty characters during his whole career after when he left the Navy and joined the FBI. So I'm trying to get my other camera hooked up and it's not cooperating for some reason. Just give me a second to try this one more time. Okay, well, I guess that's not going to be available today. I'm sorry. I wanted to play a little clip from the movie, The Battle of the Bulge, a 1965 movie with Robert Shaw, the wonderful Robert Shaw, playing the Nazi tank commander. And toward the end of the movie, his faithful sergeant is asking him, well, when are we going to go home? And the commander says, the war will go on. We have had the honor of bringing it this far, but the world is not going to be rid of us. And that's the point here that I wanted to lead into today with our show, which is that the idea of Nazism, the totalitarian control by the government of every aspect of human life, and the elimination of people who are not helpful, to use Donald Rumsfeld's word, to the state on the theory of overpopulation or of inferior genes, as we've seen so much of. Now, Fletcher Prouty was in the center of it too. His dates are 1917 to 2001. My dad's dates are 1920 to 1971. So Prouty was 3 years older than my dad and lived 30 years longer. Well, he was a little bit higher up the food chain and knew a lot of people. I think my dad was kind of not enough connected, and he just wasn't protected. He didn't have what they call a rabbi. Well, I'm going to start by reading a letter that was written to the Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty site, the reference site, and I recommend everyone to go there. It is at prouty.org. That's prouty.org. If you go to prouty.com, you'll just get some family stuff, but this is a gold mine of stuff. If you haven't run into it yet, prouty.org. It's very, very worth your time. So this is a letter written in July of 1999 from somebody named Starkovich. I don't know who that is, but it's a great letter. And so Colonel Prouty is going to respond to the letter, but first let me read it to you. July 11th, 1999. Subject, genocide and the drug war. Colonel Prouty, first let me commend you on this site. Of course, he's still alive in 1999, so it's a letter directly to him. And your work in the fight against ignorance and oppression. It will be a beautiful day when the truth is widely known, and we are a nation of educated voters and consumers. Wow, wouldn't that be great? Isn't that what we're supposed to be? Yeah, isn't that going to be a wonderful day? That's the promised land, if you ask me. A nation of educated voters and consumers. In my own research, I have been exploring the hidden people and agendas behind our $50 billion a year war on drugs. Not surprisingly, it is the very same military, industrial, petroleum, and banking fraternity responsible for the death of John F. Kennedy, and so much more of our hidden history when we look at the true movers behind our history since World War I. We see that the power elite are far from nameless. They are the very people we were taught to revere as great Americans: Dulles, Rockefeller, Ford, DuPont, Nixon, and Bush. I was therefore especially interested in your obvious reluctance to mention George Poppy Bush's role in CIA heroin and cocaine trafficking since World War II, not to mention his role in the Bay of Pigs, and his prominence in the worldwide banking and petrochemical, synthetics, and pharmaceutical industries. Perhaps, as you said, that is a whole other story. Or perhaps George Bush and his Indo-Chinese opium smuggling activities are too close to the final answer. And therefore, Bush remains the one public untouchable, and thus not the man to piss off. But is it all simply about money from drugs and weapons? Or is this battle about the basic need for food, clothing, fuel, and shelter that forces nearly every person on Earth to fight to survive? Rockefeller and the UN have told us that there is not enough food and resources on the planet to support our population, but the very concept of population control is simply the racial and industrial power theories of the Nazis, taken to a level never imagined by Hitler A world where workers have become slaves to private banks and petrochemical syndicates, while begging the government to protect them from some imagined enemy. In the early 1930s, Prescott Bush, Averell Harriman, Andrew Mellon, Rockefeller, Hearst, DuPont, GM, Ford, Alcoa, ITT, and the Dulles brothers began actively supporting the Nazis, and continued to do so through World War II. Bush and his buddies were Nazi bankers and business partners before, during, and after the war in a series of business and financial transactions that stretches the bounds of treason and trading with the enemy to new limits. Standard Oil fueled the Nazi fleets, and Chase Bank financed IG Farben and German industry. Ford built Nazi trucks, while Alcoa and U.S. Steel sent them all the raw materials they needed. ITT helped with the V2 guidance systems, and Hearst gave everybody really great press. However, they didn't supply the Nazi war machine and extend the war in a simple quest for profits. Impressed by Nazi concepts of racial hygiene that supported their own oligarchical beliefs in Darwin and Malthus, and an interest in the proven cost-saving device of slave labor, these American people and corporations enabled their German business partners to survive and thrive after the war. With the wholesale importation of the Nazi SS into the CIA by Dulles, you have to wonder who really won the war. It is with these insane theories as their justification that 30 million people are allowed to die in the third world every year, as we in the first world steal their oil. And it is the control of oil that gives the complex its real power. If you control all the energy in the world, you have all the power. If the population were allowed to grow, the demand for oil would increase, and the supply would quickly be depleted. However, if you can reduce the worldwide demand for oil, you can extend the supply. More to the point, if you control the fuel supply, you control the people. The third world gets no fuel and dies. The first world gets all the fuel we want, but we have to pay the Federal Reserve for the right to be allowed to live, quote, freely, unquote. Imagine if any farmer in the world could suddenly grow a magic plant whose fruit could feed every starving person. Its fiber could clothe every freezing child. It could be burned as industrial biomass fuel, giving cheap electricity to every factory and small town in the world. Its pulp could replace the need for wood-building materials and paper, make natural cellulose plastic that is 10 times stronger than steel, and it could supply non-toxic methanol fuel for every car on the road today. According to Popular Mechanics, in 1938, this miracle plant not only existed, but had been known for more than 12,000 years as cannabis, hemp, and could completely reverse the painful death of American family farming since the Depression. The implications were immediate for Hearst, who owned millions of acres of prime timber that would have been worthless with the advent of stronger, cheaper, less toxic hemp paper and building materials. DuPont, who held the patent on the toxic acid-based paper production methods still used today, was concerned about more than just the safer hemp paper process. DuPont also held patents, some from business deals with IG Farben, for petroleum-based synthetic fibers, plastics, paints, varnishes, and rubber, intended to replace those products already made from natural hemp-based fiber, cellulose, and oil, all of which accounted for more than 80% of their profits over the last 60 years. Even before Henry Ford built his car that ran on hemp methanol fuel and had a body made of hemp cellulose that was stronger than steel, Andrew Mellon saw that hemp could make his aluminum monopoly vanish in a puff of sodium fluoride. When Rockefeller found out that some plant could do everything his precious oil could do, cheaper and safer, he realized that suddenly a bunch of goddamn peasant farmers could replace his worldwide petroleum empire in less than a year. Not the least of his worries was the fact that if American farmers could support themselves, then so could African and South American farmers, and a self-sustaining population of the racially impure was the last thing the Rockefellers or his friends wanted. The second problem was the threat of peace on earth. If everybody were allowed to eat well and easily protect their families, well-fed people don't fight wars, and the last thing the complex wants is peaceful, content citizens who expect to be paid well for their work. This group decided it had to be stopped. The farmers must be crushed and never allowed to grow this vital natural resource. With Hearst delivering the propaganda, this group turned the most valuable plant known to man into the demon weed marijuana, the most violence-causing drug known to man, which causes Negroes and Mexicans to rape white women, unquote, and later was used by the communists to turn our soldiers into, quote, zombie pacifists. It was amid this hail of lies, that the world was convinced that the only way to fuel our world is through toxic petroleum. And with that lie, the truth about overpopulation was hidden. The only limit to individual liberty and prosperity on this planet is our forced dependence on petroleum and its petrochemical products. Worldwide, Malthusian genocide is not due to a want of food, clothing, and shelter for lack of natural resources. It is due to our forced dependence on toxic, non-renewable petroleum. Tell the world and free them from the lies, and the power elite loses power. Pull aside the curtain, and their lies come crashing down like every other house of cards. It is with this in mind that I follow the story of American history since World War I in search of the people who made the most money and consolidated the most power. What we find over and over in our recent history is a fraternity of guns, drugs, money, and genocide. World War II, corporate consolidation, Korea and Vietnam, opium and weapons, Panama, Iran-Contra, weapons, and cocaine. Follow the money to who is left standing. Rockefeller, Harriman, Dulles, Nixon, and the last in line, George Bush. I would be very interested in everything you can tell me or show me on or off the record about George Bush and his, quote, war on drugs. I'm especially interested in whatever you can tell me about our worldwide dependence on petroleum and the suppression of our natural resources at the hands of bankers and oilmen that have led to treason and genocide beyond our worst nightmares. Thank you very much, Zed Starkovich. Okay. Now, first of all, Zed Starkovich, I don't know who he is, but he speaks for me. I think he has put an awful lot of very important stuff in one letter. Reply from Colonel Prouty. It would be possible to spend the next several years developing a response to this contact from Starkovich on genocide and the drug war. During the latter years of the 40s, I was an ROTC instructor at Yale University. Many of the prominent names from Mr. Starkovich in his message are familiar to me as a function of that service and other related service during my days in the military. I commend him for his letter and can recommend books on similar subjects known as the Introduction to the Bush series. Others have been published by Executive Intelligence Review. Because the duties of my military experience carried me to at least 70 countries, I have witnessed this subject on many fronts, but this is no place to elaborate on this extremely important subject. I commend the writer for surfacing this unequaled subject and highlighting its availability. Thank you, L. Fletcher Prouty, Colonel, USAF, retired. So that is the letter from Starkovich and the reply from Prouty, and it frames to me the control of our entire lives by the petroleum industry, and specifically the banks of Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, that are financing and planning and executing their plans. Now, Prouty's part is special operations, and that's what my dad's part was in the Pentagon from 62 till his death in 71. So let's move to special operations and how they work, why they work, and more from Fletcher Prouty. The book, The Secret Team, is right here on my shelf, and this is my well-worn copy of it. I think there's a more recent edition, but it's called The Secret Team, and the CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world. In control. When he wrote this in the early 70s, they were already in control. That's what he's telling us. That's what we really refuse to believe. But that's what we will learn as we explore more from The Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty and some more essays of his that I'm going to share with you this morning. Pardon me a second. Well, this is an excerpt from Prouty.org, and the caption here is "Creating a Manichaean Devil to Justify Spending $6 trillion for a Cold War." Let's just pause and reflect on what that means. A Manichaean devil. Well, a Manichaean is a philosophical term that refers back to an event back in the ancient, Middle East, way back when. I can't remember whether it was the Babylonians or the Hittites or one of them, but they had a religious system. Maybe it was Zoroastrianism. I can't remember, but it's called Manichaeanism. And the idea is that this is a literal devil on earth, a literal God and a literal devil on earth, and our lives are basically fought out in a battlefield between good and evil. This Manichaean idea is how you get people to go to war. You sell them on this idea as children, to indoctrinate them in the Catholic or whatever religion, that there's people out there that are trying to kill us, and they're evil, and we've got to stop them. And so that's why we will devote our lives to working for the military-industrial complex, because we are afraid of that evil that's out there. And so by creating a Manichaean devil, that is how they justified all of the spending. And look at the Dulles brothers and all the work we've done to show how they, as lawyers on behalf of their Wall Street clients, manipulated us into having a active, covert CIA in the 50s that would actively go out and do horrible, horrible things. Not because the president ordered it, but because the Dulles brothers ordered it. So this is a quote from Secret Team. Those who believed that our only road to salvation lay in greater stockpiling of atomic bombs, those who argued that it must be the hydrogen bomb, and those few who said it must be both, all perhaps without common intent, began to create the idea of the, quote, enemy threat. It was coming. It was inevitable. The things that have been done since that period in the name of, quote, anti-enemy would make a list that in dollars alone would have paid for all the costs of civilization itself up to that time, with money to spare. Such an enemy is not unknown. Man has feared this type of enemy before. It is a human, and more than that, it is a social trait to dread the unknown enemy. This enemy is defined in one context as the Manichaean devil. Norbert Weiner says, quote, the Manichaean devil is an opponent like any other opponent who is determined on victory and will use any trick of craftiness or dissimulation in order to keep us, in order to obtain this victory. In particular, he will keep his policy of confusion secret, and if we show any signs of beginning to discover his policy, he will change it in order to keep us in the dark, unquote. The great truth about this type of enemy is that he is stronger when he is imagined and feared than when he is real. One of man's greatest sources of fear is lack of information. To live effectively, one must have adequate information. It was in this great conflict that the National Security Act of 1947 was brewed, and man's demand for information pervaded and surmounted almost every other move he made. Thus, a great machine was created. All of the resources of this country were poured into a single Department of Defense. Defense against the great Manichaean devil which was looming up over the steppes of Russia with the formula of the atomic bomb in one hand and the policy of world communism in the other. Our statesmen foresaw the Russian detonation of the atomic bomb in 1949 and the concurrent acceleration toward the hydrogen bomb as soon thereafter as possible, so they created the Atomic Energy Commission in January of 1947 and the Department of Defense in September of 1947 and gave both of them the eyes and ears of the CIA to provide the essential information that at any time was really the paramount and highest priority. The AEC was ordered to achieve both goals, the second-to-none atomic bomb stockpile and the hydrogen bomb, and the DoD was ordered to create the global force that would defend this country against the giant of the Soviet Union and all other nuclear powers. The atom bomb, as you know, was developed under the Manhattan Project, which was part of the Army during the war. It was obvious that at the end of the war there would have to be a continuing development with atomic weapons, fission weapons, that there would also probably be peacetime use of these weapons, and that the ability to manufacture these rare materials, plutonium and the like, for the weapons required an enormous facility and would have to be run by someone. Yet, it was inadvisable to keep that in the Army. Finally, they got the atom bomb from a monster that it had to be put in a B-29 down to where you could carry it around in the back of a Volkswagen. They improved it and enlarged its explosive power. So this was put under the Atomic Energy Commission, as well as the development of nuclear power and, to a degree, space materials, and so on. The other side of this situation, the Manichaean devil, is simply another way to talk about the Cold War. You can't get Congress to appropriate money for an enormous war organization unless you can show a reason for it. We had to create the reason. We had to create this devil, so we created communism. Even the Soviets don't understand the communism we think about. It goes so far beyond their model. And we saw it in every closet, every country. We divided up the entire world into us and them, and then began to create a military establishment that could counter, we thought, every move made by anybody. Every time India went a little bit pro-communist, India became our enemy. Every time India went a little bit towards us, they became our friend. Everybody was in that area. There were no neutrals, and it was all us and them. And that reminds me, of course, of reading The Brothers by Stephen Kinzer, another wonderful insight into the Dulles brothers in the 50s and 60s. Another reading that I did on the main channel, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. And we hope one day that YouTube will see the reason, the light, and republish that channel as well. But I'm publishing this morning more new material, stuff that says things from a different angle than we've heard before, but is part of the secret team, an explication of the secret team, so that we can understand the incredibly wide scope of what we're talking about when we say the secret team. This has resulted in the expenditure of $6 trillion for armaments, most of which can never be used effectively. There is no way to use them effectively. Even in Vietnam, we dumped 2.5 times as much bombardment on the ground in Vietnam as we did in all of World War II. To what effect? We killed a lot of people, we uprooted a lot of trees, but there was no actual military effect of that. That's what the rest of our establishment is. They could have used hydrogen bombs, and in fact, we did have nuclear weapons. Fortunately, we didn't use them, but they were there. If you create this devil and he's in every closet around the world, then you can justify having a 600-ship Navy and a something or other wing Air Force and an enormous army, because you keep telling the Congress and the American people that, my goodness, this great enormous devil is going to leap out of a closet at any day. The war could start here or could start there. We've got to be ready for the whole world. And that's how you spend the money. Even though you can't prove what you're going to do with it, you spend it. The devil scares you so bad that you don't think anymore. Take the Strategic Defense Initiative, the thing that was going to cost billions and billions. Now we spend for a B-2 bomber, which is supposed to be stealthy, and they claim that radar cannot find it. Heck, it makes more noise than almost anything you ever heard. We don't even know what we're doing. That's what the Manichaean devil does. I'd like to mention an interesting sideline about Vietnam. The Vietnam escalation modestly began in the Kennedy era, and Kennedy was said to have around him an Irish mafia. If you are familiar with the lore of old Ireland, you'll know that the Irish mother would tell her bothersome child, "If you aren't a good boy, the Kong will come get you." The Kong was a ghost in the closet. In Vietnam, the word for a beggar is a Ka, K-H-A, and they were briefing about these beggars, these troublemakers in Vietnam, and they were calling them the Viet Ka. Kennedy's young Irish mafia men, who did not know much about Vietnam, thought they were talking about the Viet Cong, the devil in the closet, and the word Viet Cong was created by mistake, by hearing the word Ka as a Vietnamese word and Kong as the Irish ghost. That's how we create our Manichaean devils. That's how we create our opposition. That's how we spend $6 trillion. Now, this next part is, to me, probably the most important, because we have been studying and understanding that there is a kind of a cancer or an octopus with all of its tentacles reaching into our government, particularly into the Department of Defense and the State Department, to control things without guidance or without any bounds as to whatever they want to do. And this has been Prouty's subject of both of his great books. I never really had a detailed explanation of how they insinuated themselves into all the different agencies and departments of the Departments of Defense and State, the other parts of our government, the White House itself. So let's read some more from this section of Prouty.org. And again, it's a interview this time by the owner of it, Ratcliffe, of Radical.org. This is Fletcher Prouty's answer to a question. When I was assigned to the Air Force headquarters in 1955, the Chief of Staff, General Thomas D. White, directed me to create an office, quote, to provide the military support of the clandestine operations of the CIA, unquote, in accordance with the provisions of the National Security Council Directive 5412 of March 15, 1954, and to operate as the Pentagon, quote, focal point office for the CIA, unquote. Now this word focal point should be the caption of this section, because this idea of a focal point is the mechanism through which the CIA insinuated itself into places like Saxa, where my dad worked. As Mr. Dulles told me later, quote, I don't want various people from my agency going into the Pentagon and dealing with different people there, and therefore exposing the activities of the CIA to a large number of people, because obviously such a ring would then proliferate to others, and if they wanted submarines, they would have to bring in some Navy people, and if they wanted helicopters, they would have to talk in some Army people, he said. I want a focal point. I want an office that's cleared to do what we have to have done. An office that knows us very, very well, and then an office that has access to a system in the Pentagon. But the system will not be aware of what initiated the request. They'll think it came from the Secretary of Defense. They won't realize that it came from the Director of Central Intelligence. Of course, Allen Dulles himself is the Director of Central Intelligence. So this was an order that Fletcher Prouty was given by his superior, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Thomas D. White. So Fletcher Prouty then becomes the person that creates the focal point, and he becomes the focal point for the CIA in the DOD. Well, it's almost as if Fletcher Prouty was being used without his knowledge to create the very insinuation system that I'm trying to study. So, but, you know, in hindsight, he's telling us all about it. I mean, so that gives me his bona fides. He's a good guy, but he's telling us what happened. I was ordered to do this, so I did it. The Dulles philosophy was to control the focal point area. This then led to the creation of focal point offices everywhere. As I established this, quote, Tab 6 organization, as we called it, in every major staff area within the Air Force, because that was my jurisdiction at the time, I would, quote, clear people. Another focal point, you might say a sub-focal point, a person I could go to who had been given ahead of time the authority to do whatever it was that he was authorized to do. So what he's saying here is that they put people in place that had previous authorization to do whatever the orders told him to do. We stressed that this was only for, quote, authorized business. He would have to be sure he had orders either from my office or directly up to the chief of staff, and that we knew what we were doing for the CIA. This leads to another step of what you might call breeding. We had to work with various agencies of the government, not just the Defense Department. We had to have contact points in the State Department, in the FAA, in the Customs Service, in the Treasury, in the FBI. Significantly, let's put a footnote there, asterisk, in the FBI, and all around through the government, up in the White House. In the White House. And by the way, in the White House was McGeorge Bundy, and we've started to learn, the terrible effect he's had on our history. Gradually, we wove a network of people who understood the symbols and the code names and the activities we were doing and how we handled money, which was the most important part. Then we began to assign people there who those agencies thought were from the Defense Department, but they actually were people that we put there from the CIA. This led to the creation of a system of powerful individuals, people whose jobs were quite dominant in some of these other agencies, especially after they'd been there 2 or 3 years, because we put them in there by talking to the top man, the cabinet officer, or the head of the agency. We would say, quote, this man is being placed here so that he can facilitate covert activities and so that he can retain the secrecy that's required, and he will keep you informed at all times, unquote. Well, in the overall U.S. bureaucracy, the top people tend to move from one job to another faster than anybody else, not the career people who are there for a lifetime. So the man we had explained the focal point structure to, perhaps a year and a half later, would be transferred or leave the government. But our trained and fully cleared focal point man was still there. So after 1 or 2 cycles of this, that agency might not even know that employee was our man and not actually theirs, because they would have no record of his special assignment or what his origins were. They would think he was just another one of their own employees. As a result, he became extremely effective. Because if we wanted something done, I remember a very sensitive operation that I needed some information on, and I needed it from the FBI. I didn't go to the FBI. I went to this guy that we had planted, and he got it twice as fast and in much better form than I would have gotten it from the FBI, even though I was at that time working for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We had no trouble working with the FBI. This process was just to facilitate it and conceal the CIA's role. These people became very, very adept. By the same token, people that were bona fide employees of CIA, that is agents, were assigned even into the Office of Secretary of Defense. We had certain people there who were CIA employees. Ed Lansdale worked for the CIA all his adult career. A person named Frank Hand worked there, but the people in the Pentagon thought they were ordinary military employees. They didn't realize they were CIA. So there's a great deception that was pulled on guys like my dad, that you think this guy is a colonel or a general and somebody who's, got a military background and a military ethic, an ethos. But no, they don't have any ethics. They're CIA. So my dad's working shoulder to shoulder with somebody in his office that's quite willing to just kill him if he doesn't do what they want. That's literally true. And that's the case right now today with anybody in an office, because you can imagine that, the insinuation is complete. We don't have the right to have honest, moral people in our intelligence agencies. Mr. Brennan, honesty is too expensive, isn't it? Sorry. So Lansdale, we've heard all about Lansdale and his horrible tactics of destroying country after country for the CIA. Not for me, not for you, not for the country. No, just for the CIA. To give you an example, Colonel Lansdale was a full colonel in the Air Force. That was his cover story, and he had been a full colonel for a few years, and the Air Force was promoting some men to general. The question came up, would Lansdale be eligible? I told Mr. Dulles personally, I said, you can make Lansdale a general if you just write a letter to General LeMay, because you're going to pay the bills anyway, and not the Air Force. Remember a little while ago when he said the important thing is to understand how the money works? Well, this is what he's telling us here, is that the CIA has the budget. It's just going to be covertly paid for through the Department of Defense, and nobody's going to know that the CIA actually paid for it. A few days later, I got a call from General LeMay's office. He called me in, and he had the list of men that the Air Force was promoting to general. And as I recall, it was 13 or 14 officers. General LeMay knew every one of them intimately except one. He said, Prouty, I understood you know who this guy Lansdale is. He said, I don't know who the hell he is. I'm not going to promote him to a general. And I said, well, don't you have a file on him? And he said, yes. He opened it up, and the top letter was from Allen Dulles. I said, he's a very important man for Allen Dulles. He said, okay, I'll promote him. Just like that. That's a good way to get a promotion, you see. But that created a very important job within the structure of the Secretary of Defense. Frank Hand had been there for years in the same way. Frank was a civilian of outstanding ability. I always wrote that he was the most important agent that the agency had, because he was operating daily and effectively as a member of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. You can just imagine the things that a person in that capacity can do when his home base is really the CIA. Although people rarely believe this when they first hear it, there are assignments like that in the White House. There are assignments like that in the State Department. For instance, it's hard to tell the difference between Bill Bundy, who was a longtime CIA employee, and his brother McGeorge Bundy, who was in the White House with Kennedy. The two brothers certainly are going to act side by side. They have the same goals and the same intentions. There were many instances that duplicated like that. It wasn't long, I'd say by the end of the 50s or early 60s, before we had spread through the government what I called a secret team, a group of people who really know how to operate the CIA business through the boundless maze of the United States government. So, let's see, it's 11:52 right now, 53. Okay, the next part I wanted to read, let's read about helicopters in Vietnam, okay? Toward the end of World War II, a small number of helicopters made their appearance in military operations. During the costly battle for Okinawa in the summer of 1945, General Joseph Stilwell, famed for his role as commander in the China-Burma-India theater of the war, began to use an early model of the Sikorsky helicopter as a command car. During the 1950s, the Korean War gave the helicopter industry a much-needed boost, and several models were used there. After the Korean War, the use of helicopters in all services was severely curtailed by high costs of procurement and by the enormous amounts of time and money required to keep them in operation. By 1959, almost all helicopter manufacturers were broke, or at least on very hard times. This included the Bell Helicopter Company in Buffalo, New York. The helicopters used on operational missions into Laos, mentioned in this article, were the only military helicopters anywhere in the world getting regular and frequent tactical use. However, their very existence in Thailand and their employment in Laos were secrets. They had been moved from Okinawa to Thailand and were supported by my office in the Pentagon. One day in 1959, a man entered my office to discuss helicopters. Because of the nature of the work my office was doing, this was an infrequent event. Outside the door of this office, there was a small blue card that read, Air Force Plans, Team B, Chief Lieutenant Colonel L.F. Prouty. That card by the door drew little attention, and it was meant to be that way. Then, how did this civilian visitor from the outside world know that Team B was the place he wanted to visit for business purposes? He introduced himself as a vice president of the First National Bank of Boston. He said he was interested in the tactical utilization of helicopters. Somehow he had been directed to Team B. Team B had been established in 1955 to provide, quote, military support of the clandestine activities of the CIA. The use of helicopters in Laos was a clandestine operation of the CIA. My visitor knew quite a bit about the helicopters in Thailand. He wanted to know if this utilization of large helicopters on tactical missions was a harbinger of more helicopters, or was it simply a make-work project? He said that the Textron Company of Providence, Rhode Island, was a major customer of his bank. Textron was in a good cash position, and the bank was advising them to diversify and acquire a marginally viable company for tax purposes, with an eye to future value. To the First National Bank of Boston, the helicopter business, and specifically the Bell Helicopter Company in Buffalo, appeared to be a prime prospect in both counts. Textron was interested. The only problem was the market. Would there ever be an interest in and a need for helicopters by the military, meaning in big numbers? The Laotian operation was the only show in town. Because of the role being played by my office in support of the use of helicopters in Southeast Asia, I already knew the Bell people well, both in Washington and Buffalo. I knew Bill Gesell, that's G-E-S-E-L, the president of Bell Helicopter. I knew they were competent, but in trouble for lack of orders. I described the helicopter as a useful vehicle of limited potential, but rather well suited for covert operations. In simple terms, the helicopter was too costly for the regular military budget, but as a rule, covert operations had money to burn. That was the kind of money helicopters needed. Because of the trend of covert operations in Southeast Asia, I believe the demand for helicopters would increase. As events later transpired, the First National Bank of Boston, of which this man was a vice president, was instrumental in getting Textron to acquire the Bell Helicopter Company. This was the beginning of the Textron acquisition of Bell and of the great success Bell had in selling helicopters for use in Indochina. As we all know now, the Bell Huey helicopter was the unsung hero of the struggle in Vietnam. Thousands were used there. On one occasion, while I was at lunch at the Army and Navy Club in Washington, D.C., Bill Gesell, I'm not sure which it is, G-E-S-E-L, still president of Bell, came by my table and pulled a check out of his pocket that was in the range of 9 figures, hundreds of millions of dollars. Needless to say, Bell was doing well. Textron was doing well. The First National Bank of Boston had earned its fees, and as a result, the remains of hundreds of Hueys are scattered all over the countryside of Vietnam. The Huey had become the famous gunship of that war. There was only one way that the vice president of the First National Bank of Boston could have come directly to my office in the Pentagon. The CIA had sent him there. This is one of the most important, truly confidential roles of the agency. The CIA is the best friend of the top executives of America's biggest businesses, and it works for them, at home and abroad. It is always successful in the highest echelons of government and finance. This is the way things were more than 25 years ago. You may be assured these successes have not diminished under the current director, William J. Casey, a true friend of business. During a speech delivered in December 1979, Casey said that he would like the CIA to be a place, quote, in the United States government to systematically look at the economic opportunities and threats in a long-term perspective, to recommend or act on the use of economic leverage, either offensively or defensively, for strategic purposes. Translated into everyday terms, Casey's CIA, as was Allen Dulles' CIA, is one of the true bastions of power as a servant of the American and transnational business and financial community. And I do want to thank Radical, Dave Ratcliffe, for the great work at radical.org and the prouty.org page. I can't say enough about it. It's got so much great stuff, and you can send away for a CD with all of his videos, all of his speeches, all of his writing from that location. Let me check in and say hello to you all at the chat room where I haven't been looking. But okay, Tehran, I'm with you as always. I would like to see some perp walks too. So there you go. Helicopters and bodies strewn across the land of Vietnam. For who? Not for me. Not for you. For them. I'll see you tonight for Strength of the Wolf.